Velkommen til en særudgave af Samfundstanker, hvor det foregår på engelsk, fordi jeg har besøg af den amerikanske professor i økonomi, Tyler Cowen. Han er professor ved George Mason University. Tyler Cowen er en af USA's førende økonomer. Foreign Policy har kaldt ham Top 100 Global Thinker, altså anbragt ham på den liste, og The Economist magazine har kaldt ham one of the most influential economists of the decade. Så velkommen til Tyler Cowen, og resten af samtalen foregår på engelsk. Tyler, in your recent book, Stubborn Attachments, which is this one, you talk about the need to be stubbornly attached to the idea of economic growth. Why is that? Why do you use that expression, stubborn attachment, about economic growth?
If you ask politicians or even economists, do you favor economic growth? They'll all say yes, like who's against, motherhood and apple pie, as we Americans say. But when you actually confront them with real-world choices, very often some other priority is found, some notion of fairness, some other value that has to be satisfied. I argue in the book that if you consider the span of decades, an economy that grows at a higher rate will generally give you citizens that are happier, better adjusted, more secure, and have more meaningful jobs. So I think economic growth is underrated.
So what other ends are the types of things that politicians also pursue that they should they should lower their preference of to the advantage of economic growth?
Well, look, it depends upon the country, but I've traveled to about 100 countries in my lifetime, and I've never met one, seen one, visited one that was too obsessed with maximizing economic growth. But I've seen the contrary in just about all of the 100 countries.
Okay, so
typically there's a notion of fairness or helping out people at the bottom of the ladder, which I'm completely for. But I think the neglected point is if you consider the compounding, increasing, ongoing gains from economic growth will do the most to help those people, not redistribution.
Okay, so you have an economy, you have a country, you're redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor, and some people want to increase that redistribution, which harms growth to a certain extent.
It depends on what you do. I fully believe in increasing human capital, most of all for the poor. So if your redistribution serves that end, for instance, it very likely will boost economic growth, and then I'm all for it. But you need an actual principle of stopping. When do you stop redistributing? There are always going to be an infinite number of claims on wealth, but you will do best by your poorer citizens, and indeed best for the world as a whole by pursuing economic growth. But absolutely, that will mean some redistribution, typically to the poor.
Climate change? Some people are saying that growth harms the environment and that we need less consumption, less growth to solve the climate problem.
I think we need more science, more innovation, more money to solve our climate problems and other environmental problems. If you go to poor societies, they typically have the worst ecological situations, not the best. And if you just ask, how are we going to get out of this? We need new ideas. We need more science. So I think it is the wealthier economies already that are leading the way, including, of course, Denmark, which has done a very good job overall in becoming greener.
It is certainly true that innovation is done mostly in wealthy countries, but you could.
And that's no accident, right?
But I agree. But you could argue that there's no time. That's what a lot of people are saying about climate change. We need to change now. There's finite. Earth is finite. Resources are finite. Time is running out because we need to keep the temperature below 2 degrees or whatever, and therefore we have to stop economic growth.
I fully agree that we need to hurry up. But if you ask yourself, when is this politically feasible? Voters don't like paying higher heating bills for their homes. Voters don't like higher gas prices. It's in wealthier societies that concern for the environment becomes more than a luxury, but starts being seen as a necessity. But of course we need to hurry up. Let's hope nuclear fusion works. More solar, more wind. Make it easier to build wind farms in the United States. I would say let's go back to nuclear in many countries. We should do all these things now. Should have done them years ago. Let's go. I'm not holding you back. I want to do it.
It's kind of interesting that in the US you did fracking.
Yes.
10, 15 years ago, you had the choice of this new technology. In Europe, we were looking at the technology as well. You went forward and did it. A new technology that boosted growth in many ways, but also helped climate, as it turned out. I don't think it was a part of the plan, but it did help climate.
It's certainly cleaner than coal. It's not perfect. I give great credit to President Obama, where none of his voters really wanted it to go ahead very much, except in a few particular states. But he quietly simply allowed fracking to proceed. Didn't talk about it much, just let it go.
Yeah.
Big plus for him.
And that's very contrary to what we did in Europe. And now we have a situation where we have a discussion about gas from Putin. We don't have our own gas. Imagine if we'd done fracking.
It would have been better to pursue economic growth, and countries such as Germany should not have dismantled their nuclear power plants. It was an enormous mistake. And you can even think one should move away from nuclear longer term, but you need the substitutes available on hand, and being green, the notion that some European countries now go out and buy dirty coal to make up for Russian gas, it's crazy.
Then there's the question of adaptation versus mitigation. So avoiding climate change is something we want to do to a certain extent, but to what extent it's possible is
Sure,
debatable.
India, China, the countries have their own agenda, Vietnam, Nigeria, the list goes on.
Yeah.
It is unlikely they all sign on to and enforce some wonderful international agreement. So at the end of the day, we need to innovate so much that green energy is cheaper for them, cheaper than coal. They actually want to do it. And the mess that we haven't cleaned up, we can somehow deal with. And that will require more science, more wealth, more institutional capability.
So we will need to adapt to climate change as well.
Whether we like it or not, no matter how good a job Denmark or even my country does, right?
Yeah. And the wealthier we are, the better we'll be at adapting.
Absolutely. Russia, how cooperative are they going to be, right? Not at all. How cooperative are they now? What does the Putin regime depend upon? Revenue from fossil fuels. So they're going to keep on going, more or less forever. So we also need mitigation. We cannot expect the world to ever become totally green, sad as that may be.
Yeah. Some people claim that we don't get happier from being richer.
They could send me their money. I'm not sure it would make me happier, but I'm pretty sure it would make them less happy. It's a very easy remark for people to make who are fairly well off. But most of the world is not so well off. You know, median income in the world is well below that of Denmark or America. And most people don't have really a true choice of job or profession or a satisfying life.
But what has that got to do with our wealth? Do we need
That is our world. It is all our world.
Sorry, our wealth, our level of income.
The wealthier the West, Japan, the more we trade with poorer nations, the more migrants we can take in, the more remittances we can send back, the more aid we can give, the more we can innovate to help them. The major driver of their growth is the West plus Japan, and now China to some extent. So to the extent, say, East Africa has developed, it's because China became wealthier in large part. Not only, but the poorer countries of the world actually need for the wealthier countries to try to become wealthier yet. And I view that actually as part of our moral duty.
What about our happiness if we get wealthier? What does economic research say about that?
It's a murky question. If you look at within a country, the wealthier people within the country clearly register as happier than the poorer people. Now, that doesn't mean the happiest moment in your life is when you have the most money. That's typically not true. But on average, yes, people are better off with more money. It's why we pay people to do jobs, right? People give away some of their money to charity. They should give more. But at the end of the day, most of it is not given away. And there's a reason for that.
So we like money.
We like money, whether we care to admit that or not.
Is it all about happiness?
I don't think so. Money helps you achieve many other goals. So one of the things my wife and I do, we send money to some poor families around the world, in Mexico and Ethiopia. I mean, you could say it makes us happier, but it's more we feel it's a good thing to do. If happiness is a byproduct, that's incidental. And we can do that because we have more money. So with money, you can achieve many ends, not just the end of me being happy in some selfish sense.
Say more about that.
Let's say your goal is to have a more creative, more fulfilling job, to help other people, to work in a nonprofit rather than in a for-profit. Well, if you have some funds saved up, you can do that and still send your children to the schools you want to send them to, say in the United States, where you have to pay for college. So you have a lot more choice. It is having some money that gives you the freedom to pursue non-pecuniary ends. The Beatles, they earned a lot of money early on touring. They were able to go into the studio, make Sgt. Pepper, masterpiece album. There were people breathing down their necks saying, go on more tours, you know, we get a cut of this, do more. They're like, no, you know, we have enough money, we're going to do what we want. And that autonomy of the artist, of the individual, very often of women or of marginalized groups, so often stems from them having some amount of money.
Yeah. Wealth creation is also something that is seen as vulgar by some people. You know, commercial culture is looked down on. That's something you've done work on.
You know, I'm an academic. I'm doing fine. I'm not a wealthy person, but I think wealth accumulation is great. It helps support the universities I teach in, the science I benefit from. Shareholders of Apple have become very wealthy from selling me and other people iPhones. I got a great deal from them. I think I pay, what, $700, $800, and I have all the world's information in my pocket. Who's ripping whom off there? I'm very happy with that. But look, they are very wealthy, the top earners at Apple, very, very wealthy. It's $1 trillion company, more.
The current situation with Russia invading Ukraine has put security policy, the geopolitical situation on the agenda. To what extent is economic growth relevant to that discussion?
The West is in a relatively strong position in that war because it has so much to do with global commerce that when private companies cut off Russia, either voluntarily or because their governments tell them to, that really hurts Russia. That's the power of Western commerce. It is quite significant, actually stronger than people had been expecting. It's no guarantee the war goes the way we want it to. Terrible things are happening there. I wouldn't say I have a prediction, but I much prefer the position of the West with that financial influence behind it, with those multinationals behind it. And to the extent we sell weapons to Ukraine, how much we will is still up in the air. We have better weapons systems, better science, better technology, higher wealth, more export prowess, easier ways to transport the weapons, better infrastructure, all the way down the line. All of that assistance is relying on our wealth. And as you probably know, Americans, presumably Danes, have sent really a lot of money to Ukraine. We've sent that money because we can afford to.
Yeah.
So wealth is on our side in this conflict.
At the moment.
At the moment. We'll see how it goes, right?
So the long-term implications of that could be...
If Ukraine had been wealthier, it would have been safer. Ukraine per capita is several times poorer than Russia. And it was not at all a well-run country. And that put them in a very precarious position. You don't see Russia invading Poland. It wouldn't work, partly because of NATO's role in that conflict. But still, the Poles have enough resources where Russia would have a very difficult time.
So you think the fact that Poland is so much wealthier than the Ukraine has an influence on...
Russia picks on poor countries. Look at Georgia, right? Ossetia. How wealthy is Georgia? Very poor, much poorer than Russia. Russia's picking on another poorer country.
If we're looking at sanctions, one of the things that's I found striking is that our financial sector that many people hate,
yes,
is actually,
leading the charge
is
of
actually becoming a sort of central thing of geopolitical importance. So we can use SWIFT and our financial infrastructure to harm the Russian economy.
So much of the power of the Western alliance stems from these forces, not just tanks and drones and bombs or whatever. It's really financial.
Yeah.
And it's not clear for how long Russia can continue to pay the bills. Now, maybe China, again, a wealthier nation, will bail them out. Possible. Hard for me to predict. But again, it's coming down to money. You'd better have some wealthy friends.
But if we think long term about this, one of the things that worries me about our sort of lack of stubborn attachment to economic growth is that what is it going to look like in 30, 40, 50 years with China being much more aggressively developing things like artificial intelligence? You know, what's going to be the future SWIFT that the Chinese would be able to use against us if we don't innovate and use technology and economic growth to gain a position of strength towards the Chinese? Is that a prospect that worries you as well?
It does worry me, but I'm more optimistic about the West than that. I just think as societies we have better ideas.
Than the Chinese?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Basic ideas of democracy, human rights, rule of law, they're just, to me, better ideas. They will make you wealthier. And if you ask the simple question, the most talented immigrants, where do they want to go? Very, very few want to go to China. So we have more diverse talents in a highly significant way. And I feel that plus better ideas, I don't think China will surpass the West in any meaningfully foreseeable future.
Okay, so the success they've had over the last few decades.
It is amazing. They deserve full credit for it.
You see it as temporary or something that will not bring them all the way up to...
Correct. I'm not a mega bear on China, but the West has better ideas. It's a better place to be, a better place to go. Most of the world knows this. So many Russians now are leaving Russia. Obviously, Ukrainians are leaving Ukraine. I think it's so far 2.7 million Ukrainians have left. How many have gone to China?
Well, that's true.
Now, okay, Poland's nearby, but it's not just that. It's the whole world knows where these people want to go. And same with the people leaving Russia. They could, go to eastern Russia, try to run down into China. I'm sure there's unguarded parts of the border. Is that a newspaper story? I don't see it. Do they want to go to Berlin or New York City or Copenhagen? Of course.
But you're also the guy who did write this book, and I think you partly wrote it because you don't think we have enough stubborn attachment to growth.
We should be truer to our Enlightenment heritage, yes.
You also wrote a book called The Complacent Class.
Yes.
About not just a class, but a really society that is getting too complacent, I think.
And this is often the case in Western Europe in particular. People feel things are good enough, they can't get that much better. Economic growth is over. They're just worried about the future rather than imagining how the future could be better. So many of us have lost that ability to imagine a radically different and better future. And that's such an important part of the Western heritage, that Western Europe had better and more deeply than anyone in the 18th century, the 19th century. World War I gives that a huge kick in the teeth. And with the European Union, Europe makes a big comeback, but somehow it hasn't quite recovered that boldness of vision, that sense of daring, that we're going to build a new world and it will be fantastic. America has more of that, but still not nearly enough. We too have become complacent.
How do you see that in the US? Let's start there.
If you just look at simple data, like how frequently do Americans move from one state to another, that's much lower today or pre-pandemic than it was, say, in the 1980s. It used to be, I wouldn't say easy, but a doable thing to just move to New York, rent an apartment somewhere in Manhattan, get a job washing dishes, and try to work your way up. It's impossible now. It costs way too much. Like, no one can do it. So our notions of mobility are weaker. Our ambitions are often weaker. There are just more and more people in the country whose parents, grandparents have had money. They take wealth for granted. So much of our dynamism, we rely on our immigrants, all the credit to them. But there's something wrong with your country when you're relying on immigrants for your dynamism. Like, you need to up your game. Immigrants come in, learn something from them. They're the ones carrying American values, not us. It's sad. It's embarrassing.
And Europe?
Well, Europe's a big place. But if you take the wealthier countries of Western Europe, you see in a lot of cases growth rates sort of that used to be 2%, now on average are much closer to 1%. Populations are aging. Often the top companies in a country will be quite old. You look at the top French companies, or for that matter, top Danish companies. They weren't developed 10 years ago. They date way back in history. And that's a sign that dynamism is not being regenerated. So I have concerns.
And what should be done about that?
Well, again, it depends on the exact specific question. So I would like to start with a cultural revolution of sorts where people in Western Europe and North America simply redefine their own intellectual heritage in their own minds, that it is much more about dynamism and change and seizing the bull by the horns and imagining this different, very different, and indeed better future. That's what I would like to start with. Now, what exactly should each country do is a much more complicated question. But that, for me, is step one. Let's at least put it on the table and try to be doing it.
And that's what you're doing right here, right now. But,
yes,
but you are an economist.
Sure, ask me a specific question. I'll try to answer.
Asking for culture to change seems like a very un-economist type of thing to say. Do you understand what I mean?
I don't think a person should be constrained by his or her initial discipline, right?
No.
We're solving real-world problems. It requires some form of synthetic knowledge.
But how would you think about changing that culture as an economist? What can economists do to create the incentives for this cultural change to take place?
If you look, say, at fellowship applications, which I read a large number of, and you just see who have been influential figures for young people, maybe 18, 19 years old, applying for fellowships. It's remarkable how many cite Elon Musk, how many cite Patrick and John Collison from Ireland of Stripe, how many cite Peter Thiel as venture capitalist. It has a real impact on people. So I think ideas really matter, books really matter, writing on the internet really matters, podcasts matter immensely. It's amazing what influence they have. Imagine there's people there listening to us. We're just saying stuff. We're these two guys, and there's people listening.
Yeah.
But it's mind space. And I think to go into whichever media you can do and present your ideas, and it will matter.
Is that why you do your podcast? By the way, to listeners and viewers, Conversations with Tyler, I can highly recommend it. And we'll link to it in show notes of the podcast version of this.
That is why I do my podcast. You know, speaking of money, I'm not paid to do it, so I'm not getting any extra happiness through that channel. So it's going to be the podcast I want. And I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs. Yeah. Chairman of the board of Moderna, which of course gave us Moderna vaccine, mRNA. I had a great podcast with him. I think he deserves to be better known, more respected, higher status.
Okay, so you present people with highly productive, highly successful people. Say, look.
And why they're important, why they're interesting, why they're smart, why they're not just some rich guy who earned a lot of money.
So that's part of the cultural change.
That's part of the cultural change,
okay.
And I'm trying to be part of it.
Okay, interesting.
And you know, I see it working, actually. I think at least America has started to become more dynamic, and I see more of my fellow intellectuals say, you know, we can't take our wealth for granted. We need to actually produce things, take in more high-skilled immigration, make it easier to build new structures, make it easier to build out the subway in New York City, put in high-speed rail where it's needed, and so on. It's become a movement. So to me, this is encouraging. I get the final results are not in place, but I don't feel like this is a losing battle that I'm part of. Quite the contrary.
Mm. How important do you think economic policy is in all of this? Tax rates. Denmark has very high taxes on capital gains, for instance. We have relatively high taxes on marginal taxes on income.
Well, you spend your money relatively well, so I don't think you can consider a tax rate in isolation. It does seem to me, as an outsider, that the share of government spending in GDP is too high here, and it will need to fall somewhat. That as Danish society ages, especially if you are relatively strict with immigrants, it will become at some point fiscally unstable and require some modest adjustments. Whether you like that or not, that just, to me, seems like a fact.
I agree with you that compared to many countries, the money is relatively well spent, but some of it is, some of the revenue is created in ways that has influence, like capital gains taxes on incentives to invest, for instance.
Right.
And that's what I was referring to.
Those probably will need to fall. Yeah. I've never studied Danish capital income taxes as a thing, but based on what I know, that is my intuition, yes.
Do you have any view on the total regulatory burden, the tax? The legislative body that is preventing entrepreneurs to move into new areas.
It's often worse in the United States. So everyone says, oh, we're laissez-faire capitalism. It's so far from the truth. You have the state government, right? The city government, the county government, the federal government. And you might have 50 state governments to deal with, all with their own set of restrictions, layers of environmental review, regulations. It's almost impossible for a lot of entrepreneurs to deal with that. America is not a free country. It's not an economically free country. The Nordic countries, in some but not all ways, are much freer with regard to regulating business. There can be a lot of regulation, but it's sort of cleaner, easier to deal with, more centralized, more transparent. And we are a wreck and a mess in the United States. So I would hope we could learn a lesson from all of you. So far, that's not happening.
Have you read Thomas Philippon's book on the Great Reversal?
Yes.
Where he claims that creating the internal market in Europe has revitalized competition in Europe, whereas competition in the US is weak?
I don't agree with that. I wrote a review of the book spelling out some detailed reasons why. But I think so much of a modern economy is services. European service competition is actually not really deregulated across borders. Sort of technically, maybe it is, but to actually make it work is difficult, and then across languages. You know, try being a lawyer who moves from one EU country to another. Unless you're doing like multinational law, typically not very easy. He overrates how monopolized is the US economy. Sectors such as hospitals, yes, some of our healthcare, but most of the US economy, there's never been more choice ever before. You can buy things off the internet. Amazon, Walmart, other big companies sell you things at very low prices. There's amazing selection. US is super good at retail for whatever cultural reasons. So our retail sector is pretty cheap. I don't myself shop at dollar stores, but if you want, you can actually buy things in dollar stores. And now they're up to like $1.25 instead of $1. But my goodness, if you want to look anywhere for competition, it's America.
That would be my sense as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I disagreed with his book fundamentally.
Okay. So this is a special version of this program where I'm speaking to Professor Tyler Cowen, who is professor at George Mason University in the US, and we're talking about the importance of economic growth. And we have moved into a sort of policy side of that a little bit, but we came from discussing culture and what's happened to culture and why Western culture may have been slacking a little bit. But you are more bullish on Western culture than you are on China.
By far.
Which I think puts you in a group that is it's slightly unusual viewpoint. A lot of people think that China and the East is the future, and we're sort of the.
That's what I call recency bias.
Yeah.
So if you look at the broader span of human history, I think the ideas that came from, ancient Greece, the Middle East, ultimately grew into the Roman Empire, now modern Europe, North America being its proudest offshoots. To me, there's more talent, more diverse talent there. The ideas of a written constitution, rulers accountable to the people, something approximating free speech, individual liberties. I think those are the best and most productive ideas. And I look at China, I can see it's more authoritarian. There's some things they can get
worse.
Getting much worse. Some things they can get done more quickly. Greater respect for ancestors, that may be admirable. But overall, much less well geared for rapid change. They're now having massive problems constraining COVID. They refused mRNA vaccines because they weren't Chinese.
Yeah.
That, to me, says it all. And that kind of mentality over time is a bigger problem than whatever problems you see in Western thought, which are real, to be clear.
There's an irresistible parallel to the centralized discussion the centralized decision back in the, what was it, the 14th century, I think, to continue.
To stop exploring the world at precisely the time when that's what you should have been doing.
Yeah. The Chinese had more ships, larger ships,
better technology,
and they decided to look inward and stop exploring the world at a time when Europe started doing it.
And here they had mRNA vaccines licensed from Pfizer. They thought their own vaccines were good enough, or they couldn't carry the message to their citizens that it was foreign vaccines. So they waited and waited and waited. We'll develop our own Chinese mRNA vaccine. Now Omicron has shut down Shanghai and Shenzhen as we're speaking. There's not a lot of native immunity in the population. The vaccines they've been using don't seem to work very well. Hong Kong right now has the highest death rate of any place during the whole pandemic at any point in time, like higher than New York in March, April 2020. So I'm not sure what will happen there, but it looks pretty bad to me.
Yeah. And they're trying this zero COVID strategy instead of using vaccines, which
I don't think it can work. They should have humbled themselves, bought as many mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and others as they could have. Also other Western vaccines, which are not, like AstraZeneca, Novavax. They didn't do it.
So these centralized, really bad decisions.
And Russia just made one too, right? Invading Ukraine, disastrous.
Yeah.
Obviously awful for Ukraine, but for Russia too.
Yes.
A huge mistake.
Yeah.
And autocracies can have runs of making a lot of good decisions. You see it in many places in history, not just recently. But sooner or later, the flows of information become lower quality. People are afraid to report bad news to the higher-ups. The higher-ups become deluded. They're not accountable to the public. And very bad things happen. And we see this again and again. And we've been tricked into thinking somehow these autocracies work better than free societies, but they don't.
I guess they had a run.
They did.
For a few years. Turkey became more of an autocracy at a period when they did okay.
China did very well.
Hungary, China, even Russia did relatively well.
For early years of Putin, they did fine,
Yeah. And then all of these are actually reversing now. Hungary, for different reasons, they're having some trouble now with, Orban is having some trouble positioning himself vis-a-vis Putin. But that's a different story. But the big ones, Turkey, Russia, China, we're still waiting to see what's going to happen.
And this gets back to the title of my book, Stubborn Attachments.
Yes.
Stay stubbornly attached to your principles, if those principles are well derived.
So apart from growth, what are the central principles?
I would say human rights. Here's a simple question. If you want to go out in the world and look for the poorest Chinese people in the world, where will you find them? You'll find them in China. You won't find them in Denmark. You won't find them in the US. You probably won't even find them in Brazil. You'll find them in China, not Taiwan, not Singapore, which are freer societies. Taiwan, I would say, is fully free.
In fact, the Chinese tend to do pretty well outside of China.
Remarkably well. And they do the worst in China when they are under these principles. You wouldn't call it proper communism anymore, but it's a form of authoritarianism, state control, no real emphasis on human rights or individual liberties or free speech. Those principles are just trampled on every day. And those are worse ideas. I will insist on this until I die.
Is it ideas or is it culture?
Well, ideas are a part of culture. You can call it either. I think it's both.
I think there's a difference. You can change ideas. It's harder to change culture.
Yes, and ideas come from culture.
I agree. But Chinese living outside of China seem to have different ideas and a different culture.
Chinese culture is amazing and wonderful, and it's reflected in many different areas. My personal interest would be food from China, maybe the world's best.
Yeah.
But there's something about its culture, for all its virtues, when you apply it to law, state, and governance, it doesn't work well. You see this also in the Middle East. Lebanese, among others, do phenomenally well in other parts of the world. It's completely wrong to say they just have this rotten, lousy culture.
Yeah.
But when it comes to governance, you need a very particular kind of culture. And Denmark actually is one of the world leaders in this. Even by the standards of Western Europe, you could argue the modern state was developed first in Denmark and England, not France, not Germany. A true modern nation state with legitimacy and standardized procedures. Frank Fukuyama covered this at length in his book. Denmark was the leader, maybe even before England in some ways. So when we're talking about this in Denmark, I'm acutely aware this is the world's #1 place for a big part of that vision. You were all first, not seventh, not like Europe was first. Denmark.
Yeah, well, we started fighting corruption very early.
Yes.
But it was a very corrupt society that...
As was Singapore once, yeah.
Yeah. Happened faster in Singapore, But over 100 years or so, we got rid of corruption in Denmark, and but that's the time it took. In Singapore, it took about 50, something.
Less even, but yeah, many things happen quicker today.
Yeah.
But how much Denmark is a leader in principles of governance? I don't live here. I don't have a sense of how much contemporary Danes know this, but as an outsider, I'm completely aware of it. I land in the airport at Copenhagen. There's almost tears in my eyes. I feel I'm somewhere special, and I am.
Thank you. That's very nice.
England, too, I have the same feeling. When I flew to London before I came here, certain democratic ideas come very early from England, the role of Parliament and so on. Obviously, England is a kind of mother nation for my own America, and you ought to feel that emotionally when you enter these countries.
Yes. I think the danger is, you're so kind to bring up Denmark, which is a favorite subject.
Because you're so excellent, you become complacent.
Yes, but there's also a danger of a development similar but different to what's happening in China, in that we have a very big welfare state, and we have some decisions that are being centralized to an enormous extent. 80% of media, TV, radio production is state-owned.
Yes.
That works as long as Denmark works the way it does. But if it was Russia, we'd say, and indeed it's the same situation as Russia, we would say that's a sign of a malfunctioning state in some ways.
The fact that your COVID response was so good, and it was, in part it worries me. It means there's a certain conformism, which is highly useful during a pandemic, but is not always functional in other settings.
Yeah, I agree.
That said, congratulations on mostly getting it right.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful of your successes, right?
It's an amazing thing that one day you get on the train and everybody wears a mask, and the next day the law saying you need to wear masks is taken away, and nobody wears a mask.
And Americans are still arguing about it, and maybe will be for 20 years.
And nobody argues about it really here. A few people do, but not very many.
Yeah.
It's not a politicized issue.
Like, my personal view is, I'm not sure how well they work. I think there's a good chance they might work, so I'll put one on and do whatever is expected of me and focus on other things. But Americans find it very hard to take that attitude. It's either a badge of honor and pride and signaling to the world, a mask outside, that you're like properly left-wing, or you refuse to wear a mask even in a bar to show you're like a tough guy, properly right-wing. Both of those attitudes to me are kind of American dysfunction. I'm like, I'm not sure, but I'll just put this on.
Yeah. So the Danes have decided that they want to show the world that we can reduce carbon emissions by 70% in 2030. So we're going beyond what the Paris Agreement says we need to. We go beyond what the European Union says we need to. So we're sort of going way out there to show the world.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be amazing if Denmark was a showcase on growth as well?
Economic growth, absolutely, and how to deal with aging, and how to regenerate a whole new set of companies, comparable, say, to Maersk, but much newer. This is one thing where my country does awesomely well, which is generate new companies that become major companies every decade. Yeah. Most recently, the tech companies, but not only. Any area you look, you just find so many top American companies are pretty new. Yeah.
But in Europe and in Denmark, you see new technologies being, you see a lot of skepticism. We had Uber for a while in Copenhagen. Now it's banned. GMO, we're viewing with great skepticism in all of Europe. It's being heavily regulated.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence.
Oh, Germany's terrified.
Fracking.
Yeah.
There's
you will lose the future.
All kinds of things going on there.
Any point in time, it seems fine until it isn't. And 50 years from now, it will be deeply, deeply regretted if that's the continuing trend.
But that's in some ways similar to the Chinese thing, isn't it? We have central authority deciding which technologies we are to use and which we're not to use. And they're skeptical towards a lot of new technologies. Not all, but a lot of new technologies.
I worry about too much centralization in most countries of the European Union, yes.
So what can be done about that?
It's a big, complicated question. But I would like to see a great deal of deregulation in many parts of Europe, including the service sector, a lower burden of government on society. But in general, you need a cultural change to sustain that. Things like that don't come from nowhere. They don't stick around unless people believe in the new order of things. And more of an emphasis, let's just try for 2.5% growth, for 5-10 years. Let's just see if we can do it. Set it as a challenge. If you can't, well, okay, you've learned something. But let's just try. Let's have a politician, a party, a platform, whichever country, the 2.5ers, which is not an insanely high number, right? But it's higher than what it's been. And let's just try to do that one thing and watch those returns increase, compound, build on each other over time. And then by the time your grandchildren get here, they will be much better off because you did that. So it's a very forward-looking vision. In the moment, what's the difference between 2.5%? Like, people don't notice, it's invisible, but it really matters.
In each individual year, it's
negligible, or it feels negligible, but it piles up. Again, it's this notion of compounding. If you invest well, say, in stocks, and you earn whatever percent each year, it grows on top of itself, and decades from now, it makes a huge difference, though even in any single year, you only feel a little wealthier. That's the whole point, is compounding returns.
Yeah. It's the difference between thinking short-term and long-term in general, I guess.
Right. But if you have no vision for how the future can be much better, you won't see why you should do that. Because the present might feel too good or just feel satisfactory enough, feel too comfortable.
But it's hard to have that vision because some of the stuff that we have today is an iPhone wasn't thought of 1 year before it was created. It was a genuinely new thing that nobody had thought of before.
But there's many early versions of it that people try to make. Maybe they fail. They don't have the materials. They try to make smart tablets for some while. So you have people working on this idea for over a decade, not succeeding. Steve Jobs puts all the pieces together. And he just demanded it be done. He set that as a target for Apple. People within the company said, Steve, you're crazy. He's like, no, we're going to do this. Elon Musk, the same way. The rocket that goes up and then just lands back again on the pad, that seems crazy, but I've seen it. It's not fake news.
You've been there watching it?
But no, I've seen it on YouTube.
Okay.
And what was needed, it's not actually a super radical new technology. You needed an individual person, Elon Musk, who insisted it could be done. Or Steve Jobs, he insisted the iPhone could be done and that it would not just work, but be an object of beauty, admired around the world. And they both did it. So these are all cases that if they hadn't happened, you would have either not thought of it or it seems impossible or, gee, aren't we doing well enough without these rockets? Any one thing, you can say that. But again, over the decades, over the centuries, your society is done, if that's your general attitude. Done.
I agree. But I think part of the challenge there is that even after the iPhone was invented, I mean, Nokia got it and they looked at it and said, well, okay, this is interesting. But it was only as people started using it and new apps and ways of using it were developed that we started realizing what had happened. And so this vision is, you can't sit here now and imagine what a society that's twice as wealthy as what we have would be like. What we imagine is we will have twice as many cars and they will fill up the streets. But of course, that's not what's going to happen. We're going to have driverless cars or we're going to have flying cars or whatever. But it's all stuff that we can't really imagine the ways in which all that will be useful to us.
That's why it's hard to stay focused on the future. It now seems possible there'll be commercially viable nuclear fusion. Super green, very safe. The consequences of that, I can't think through. I know scientist friends, I talk about it with them, they can't think it through. But to be in a world of really cheap, quite green energy, you don't have to worry about the sun setting or the wind dying down. I think if it happens, it will be phenomenal. But if it happens, you need people to see it through who are totally convinced the future matters. It's interesting to me, Elon Musk from South Africa, a troubled country, not a complacent country, he realized you can't just sit still, like the world will come get you. That to me is noteworthy. Steve Jobs is, in his background, Lebanese, not born in Lebanon, but That too is notable. True American values being carried by people who are not quite as closely tied to America.
Okay, so some people would argue, say, it's not about culture, Tyler. It's the fact that it's just the way it is. All the great stuff has been invented. True, we're inventing lots of stuff, but it's Twitter and things that are not creating as much growth as some of the stuff we used to invent.
Aren't you glad they didn't say that about the mRNA vaccines? Madeline Carrico, she worked on it for 20 years, didn't get a real academic job, was looked down upon. People thought it was nonsense. I talked to a number of specialists in early 2020. They said, Moderna's never made a vaccine before. This stuff won't even work. Where are we now? And by the way, immigrants got us there, for the most part. And the Pfizer, BioNTech, German vaccines from Turkish migrants. A group looked down upon in Germany for a long time. And they're the ones who pull it off. What does that tell you?
I would agree. And I would also say that in a dynamic economy, the new stuff will be turned into something that's valuable. It's not valuable in itself. It's the way markets take it in and innovate and use it. And there's so many patents now, and there's so much happening in biotech and materials technology and all kinds of stuff that creates opportunity, which for some reason is not being turned into growth right now. And that says something, you say, about our culture. I agree. I think this also says something about economic policy, tax rates, and stuff like that.
Sure.
But some people are claiming that, globalization has already happened, and now that'll be moving in the opposite direction. Demographics have been favorable previously, and they're not so favorable now, etc., etc., etc. And the counter-argument, I guess, is to say that a dynamic economy and a dynamic culture solves those problems.
Maybe solves is too strong a word. Look, those are real problems, aging, deglobalization, but it's up to us to confront those and overcome them. So just a simple example. 30 years ago, not that much scientific talent came from India, even though it had a large number of people. And now so much talent, scientific CEOs, tech innovators, comes from India. So mostly they did something right. Maybe we helped them. It's an amazing story how much talent now comes from India. Was not well predicted 30 years ago. How many other parts of the world can we make like India? Again, I'm not saying it's easy, but it definitely can be done. It's stuff not many people saw. You need people totally dedicated to doing it. We can make so much more of the world like India.
Let's wrap up this discussion talking a little bit about immigration, because you've brought it up a few times, and Americans talking about immigrants sound very different from Europeans talking about immigrants.
And within Europe, there's a lot of variation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
But certainly Danes talking about immigrants mainly talk about problems.
Right.
And you talk about resources. You talk about innovation. You talk about ideas, talent.
Your model relies so much on social cohesion that I don't know how many immigrants you can successfully take in. As an outsider, I just genuinely don't know. Okay. But I think the countries, Canada, Australia, UK, United States, that are sort of geared to deal with a certain amount of chaos or diversity or disorder, for that reason, have some bright futures. Even Sweden, which in some ways has had bad migration policies, it's a bit of a wreck. Danes will often look down on Sweden like, oh, we don't want to become that. I understand that. But Stockholm has a very vibrant startup scene. It's arguably the most open place of the Nordic countries. I'm not even sure it will work out for them. But I'm just saying, realize it's a trade-off. And again, I don't know if Denmark should switch its model. But the places that have the other model, it's working really well for them. Doesn't mean everyone can do it.
But wouldn't you say that that would be the weakness of the Danish cohesive model?
Of course. It's relatively close to outsiders.
So there's a balance there.
Yes, and again, I don't know what point on that scale Denmark should find. No. But to be aware of the trade-off is at least the beginnings of thinking that through.
And it is part of Danish discussion. Business people tend to be more open to immigration, and they do point out that they need talent to come into the country, and it is not helpful to have a debate about immigrants that is very hostile.
Here's a way to think about it. Say 40 years ago, so much of talent was in Europe or North America, maybe Japan. The next 40 years won't be anything like that. So much of talent will be from poorer countries, non-white countries, non-Christian countries, all sorts of complications. So a country has to make a decision, like how will it deal with that? Again, it will vary by country. But it's not like the old world where you can just kind of pull in a bit of talent from Germany, have a few Americans come by. Radically different world coming up. And it's going to matter. How much talent's leaving Ukraine right now? You assume the people getting out on average
Russia.
are more talented. And Russia. Who is well geared to take advantage of that? I've actually become a lot more optimistic about Poland than I had been. I was never pessimistic. But now I see a lot of that talent settling in Poland, Warsaw becoming a kind of tech hub. Already some wonderful talent from Ukraine, like Vitalik Buterin of, Ethereum. And I think Poland, assuming that whole part of the world doesn't just blow up, but Poland is well situated to come out ahead here. We'll see, of course.
It's interesting because Poland is has been over the last few years a very conservative country moving in a slightly authoritarian direction. Not that they're not there, but it's been a bit of a concern.
And it should be. But I'm more optimistic about them now. They will have other problems on their hands, which are not good problems to have, to be clear. But I think it will distract them from some of their creeping other problems. Huge injection of talent, a chance to really build something. And I was in Warsaw a year before the pandemic. Just walking on the streets of Warsaw, you feel a dynamic of growth that you don't feel in most of Western Europe. Warsaw, of all places, has a sense its future can be much better than its past. It may or may not get there. But I came away, really cheered from the time I spent in Warsaw. Mm.
Even the U.S. has a tension when it comes to immigration. Trump.
Absolutely. We've gotten much worse at it.
Why is that?
Well, we took in individuals at such a high rate. American history more generally is alternating periods of extreme inflow, and then you tighten the controls and you absorb. And then you open them again, you tighten, you absorb, back and forth. So maybe we're just doing back and forth, which is what our history had been in the past. So I hope,
business as usual.
I hope it's nothing worse than that. But if we truly close our borders to foreign talent, the U.S. will cease to be a great nation, and we will have wrecked a wonderful creation, and that will make me very sad.
Sounds similar to what some Danes are saying with the opposite sign.
Yes.
That the reason why Denmark works is that it's such a cohesive, homogeneous nation, and if we open it up to immigration, we'll destroy what we have.
I think they're mostly right, but here's the thing. What you have had is going to change anyway. So you can let it change and 15 years from now be reactive and have fewer choices, or you can proactively steer it and be more in control and build a better new thing. So I would consider that. Like the people who say all that, I think they're correct. Like if you let in all these migrants, you'll change the old social cohesion system. But it's changing anyway. And you want to be ahead of where it's headed, or like chasing after and actually not have many choices because you just let it, the clock tick for too long.
And be ahead, does that mean choosing who to come in, or what does it mean changing
Whatever
culture?
vision you have, changing culture, changing who comes in, under what terms, how it's done. A lot of different dimensions. Again, I don't know what you should do, but there's an argument to be made for you can't stay this closed forever. Let's be proactive and get, the people best for our system while we can.
Turning full circle, I guess a high-growth economy will be better at absorbing immigrants than a low-growth economy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think economies with a number of different centers of power do better. So Canada is an example. Obviously, the U.S. Like Toronto's the most important city, but there's Vancouver, you have Montreal. They're kind of separate islands, and in between is like empty country. And they're not that well integrated. I think, you go to South Korea, the contrast. Well, there's Seoul, like a third of the people live in and near Seoul. Everyone sees everything that happens. You don't have as many experiments. But Canada, Australia, you have these isolated islands of cities that experiment, become different. No one quite sees the whole picture. I think that's proven useful for them. And they compete against each other. And they compete against each other by taking in foreign talent, among other ways. Whereas here, Copenhagen, it really is dominant. In Korea, Seoul is dominant. This is not really ever going to change, right? So you don't have that competitive process. You don't have the distance. You don't have the diversity. You don't have as much experimentation. So it is harder.
Tyler Cowen, thank you very much.
Thank you.